Okay, so I want to cover a pretty taboo subject. Even though the subject's connected to history, I would argue more than contemporary events. I won't say that it's totally irrelevant to the contemporary world. I think that would be pretty ignorant and brash to make that claim. But it is connected to history, and it refers to President Obrador of Mexico, who was only inaugurated this year, calling for Spain, and I believe he included Portugal as well, to apologise for their role in the colonization of the Americas. Without question, the Spanish Empire in particular was particularly ruthless and bloody. I mean, there's countless examples of massacres that took place in Latin America and South America during the 16th and 17th centuries. Um, I would argue they went further than the British Empire in terms of brutality. Um, but I think there is a lot of talking points with this. Firstly, when President Obrador came to power, he was the first truly left-wing leader in modern Mexican history. So it shouldn't be overly surprising that he's making a gesture like this, or a call like this, rather. He did say during his election, I remember because I watched reports, that he would be a different sort of president, and that he would be a president for all Mexicans. And it is true that indigenous Mexicans still face the sort of struggles that minorities face in many countries. They still find themselves in greater poverty, with fewer opportunities and so on than Mexicans of European descent. That is true. So there's clearly a lot of issues to address. Um, but the call for a formal apology from the Kingdom of Spain um, really opens a question, and that is, should people today, that is, governments and individuals, apologise for what their ancestors done? Now, this is a question often that we have to grapple with as well. There has been attempts to sue the modern British government for what the British Empire done. One of the most recent examples, I mean, recently in history, is the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where the British were accused of torture and other inhuman treatment. I have no doubt that there were moments at that time we were less than noble. I've no doubt about it. Um, However, it was a conflict, it was an armed conflict, and the Mau Mau were not above killing civilians. So it's not like one side was totally innocent and one side was totally guilty. I think that would be a perversion of history. Nevertheless, as a colonizing power, we were the Goliath to their David. Um, the question of reparations is a difficult one because here's the problem. If you give reparations for past wrongs, where do you draw the line? How far back do you go? Because if you really wanted to get down to it, and people might say this is a flippant dismissal of the issues, I don't think it is. Because if you really want to get down to that philosophy, then should we ask for reparations from the Kingdom of Norway for Viking pillage in England? I mean, one of the first Viking raids in England was here in Sunderland. In fact, this was even before the Kingdom of England was founded. So, if you want to get back to your people done this to my people, then the entire world, to some extent or another, would be owing reparations to other parts of the world. What I do believe is that governments need to acknowledge the darker sides of their past. So, the British Empire did commit atrocities. That's why it was right that when David Cameron went to India, he acknowledged what we'd done at Amritsar. But there are Hindu nationalists who want us to grovel at their feet and make repayments forever. That isn't going to happen. And I would also say that, particularly with India, India should think carefully about constantly pointing the fingers at the British. I mean, post independence India, take I'll just give one example. There's many, but I'll give one example. The emergency during Indira Gandhi's tenure in the mid 70s was accused of severe human rights abuses. Not to mention the Indian Army's behaviour in Kashmir over the years. In India, you can't even say that. Because of ultranationalism, you'd be accused of being a traitor to the country. And, we're talking in the UK about um, compensation for victims of Bloody Sunday. In India, you couldn't even have a discussion about the wrongs of the Indian army. So I feel a little bit, it's a bit hypocritical for India to constantly bring up the empire. India's been an independent country now for 72 years. So I have a problem with that always being used to deflect criticism from contemporary issues. I mean, goodness knows India has no shortage of human rights abuses. Although it likes to boast about being the world's biggest democracy, it has no shortage of human rights abuses. I know there's Indians who recognize this and they're trying to do something about it, but there's no question about it. India, like China, ultra nationalism is a very big driving force there. So, if any British investigative journalists, or goodness knows the British government were to ever raise human rights issues in India, they would immediately say, oh, what about the empire? What about Amritsar and so on? Well, like I say, I think the role of governments in the present context is to acknowledge their past. I mean, if you look at a country like China, the current regime in China doesn't even acknowledge what happened in Tiananmen Square 30 years ago. It's not a case of they say, oh, we had to act against protesters. They just deny its very existence. According to the Chinese Communist Party, nothing happened in June 1989. I would argue that Western countries are far more honest about the past than the majority of Asian countries. And that might be an inflammatory or controversial claim, but I would say it's true. And what's my basis for that? It's this. If you go into any American library, you can look up the civil rights movement. In fact, it's taught in the American curriculum, as it should be. There's a Martin Luther King Day. Here in Britain, we have statues to Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi. Now, what does that tell you? That's hardly a colonial power denying its crimes, is it? When we're honouring the very people who fought against us. I mean, that to me is saying something. But the issue I have with a formal apology is it promotes the notion of personal guilt. And I do not believe that today's British government or individual Britons are responsible for what happened during the British Empire. Okay, you could argue the Mau Mau uprising was the 1950s. That's within living memories. So there will be some older veterans who are alive who may well have done immoral things at that time. But the passage of time, are they going to be put on trial? I don't think so. And then you would have to say, well, if they're put on trial, well, what about old Mau Mau fighters who may well have killed civilians? Is it going to be applied fairly? I think sometimes when we get into debates about colonialism, it's too easy to fit into a black and white narrative. And people will say I'm an apologist here. No, I think every empire by nature exploits and they show cruelty and they do brutalize. It's the nature of empire. But here's the thing, when you want to talk about empire, the rational thing to do is to put it in context of other empires. Every empire commits exploitation, commits atrocities. We're certainly no secret to it. The Belgian Empire was one of the worst. I mean, what happened in the Belgian Congo from 1886 to 1908? Millions of Congolese died, some estimates as many as 8 million people, which would make King Leopold II one of the bloodiest dictators in history. I mean, what he done in those rubber plantations was pure evil. Um, and I would say that's probably the worst example of colonialism in Africa. So, look, every empire has blood on its hands. There's no question about that. But let's just look at the Native American issue for a second. It's been very well documented. I mean, pretty much any contemporary Western film, frontier film, would have to show the exploitation and the cruel treatment of Native Americans because it wouldn't get a license to be shown if it didn't have that angle. And that's fine, but I have a bit of a problem with this idea that pre Columbian America, and this will be a controversial statement, but it's absolutely based in fact, that pre Columbian America was this peaceful utopia where thousands of different groups of people just got on with each other, as if there was no exploitation, as if there was no human slavery, as if there was no human sacrifice. I remember when Mel Gibson's film Apocalypto was released, some critics complained, oh, it makes indigenous people look violent. Well, there were there were violence in some of those cultures. There's a tribe in northern Brazil, I forget the name, begins with Y, but warfare is part of their way of life. In fact, it's a coming of age of young men to have a kill. It's part of that culture. So the only reason that European empires did manage to colonize the Americas was because of military prowess. It's not that they were evil and the indigenous Americans were pure and innocent. It's just that they were the superior force militarily. And it's awful. It was exploitation. But this idea that the colonialists were evil monsters and those they colonized were all innocent and never committed their own atrocities is just a lie. And it's kind of this left wing revisionism of kind of self guilt. The way I see it is we should acknowledge the past. We should be honest about the past because the only way a country can go forward is by acknowledging its past. But a formal apology indicates personal responsibility for something. It's like if you happen to know a thief, right, and that thief steals from someone, you would feel embarrassed. You wouldn't want to be friends with them anymore. But would you apologize to the victim on their behalf? You might, but personally, I would say, "Oh, it's terrible. I'll find this guy for you," or something like that. But the way I see it is, you only apologize if you have personally done something wrong. I think you should accept the truth. I think, for example, the modern British government should accept we done terrible things during imperial rule. We did. But if you go down the point of reparations, where does it end? I mean, where do you draw the line? Pretty much every culture in history, with a few exceptions, has in some way killed or taken land or brutalized others. I mean, within the context of pre Columbian America, this idea that all the different groups of people just lived side by side. I'll give you an example. The Cherokee kept slaves. They were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, have they ever made a formal apology to African Americans? I don't know. Maybe they have. But it seems to me that it's only the guilt is only ever directed at white oppressors. And I'm not one of these white nationalist types that talks about white genocide and all that nonsense. It's not like that. I'm just saying that it's there does seem to be double standards. So if we're going to say that violence is immoral, that suppression is immoral, that exploitation is immoral, then it seems to me the criticism is only reserved because those empires were so dominant, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, then they get more criticized because, I mean, look at Mexico, look at pre Columbian Mexico. Human sacrifice was a fact. Among the Aztecs, it happened. And we know it happened because there's archaeological remains of human remains that show signs of brutality. And they were at religious sites. So I just think there's a bit of presenting the European colonization of the Americas as black and white, as the evil Europeans versus the pure native people. It's making history overly simplistic, and I do have a problem with that. So no, I'm not making excuses for any of the atrocities that were committed. Here I am saying, yes, it did happen. There was exploitation, there was brutality, and it was wrong. It was wicked. But the narrative that it was all one-sided, I think it's just reflecting the fact that the European powers were militarily more, they were superior. If the Native Americans had the military prowess that the Europeans did, you know, there's the killing would have went both ways. As for they owned the land first, actually they didn't. A lot of those Native American nations, they didn't see land ownership as a thing. It was about being in one with nature. So the idea, oh, they were there first. Well, if you want to get really pedantic, there is a theory that they migrated at the last ice age. That there may have been an even older group of people there, sort of early modern humans. Now, with all the scientific research that's being done, how do we know that Native Americans of today, their ancestors thousands of years ago, didn't, take over and kill the people who were there at that time? We never talk about that because it's still being researched. But I just have a problem with this black and white view of history. History is very rarely black and white. So, as for President Obrador's calls for Spain to apologize, I think Spain should acknowledge it. I don't think Spain should glorify their past. I think they should acknowledge, yes, the conquistadors done terrible things. Um, and I think Spain should be honest about that. But a formal apology, where do you draw the line? At what point do you say, okay, well, everyone owes everyone something? And ultimately, it would become your people kill my people, so I hate you. I personally think it fosters divisions. I think President Obrador would be better addressing issues to do with wealth poverty discrepancy, opportunities, that sort of thing, and indeed addressing the drug war, the very violent drug war that's cost over 100,000 lives. I would have thought that's a bigger priority than this sort of populist point scoring, because I think this is kind of a pitch to get Indigenous votes. That's how I see it. Anyway, let me know your thoughts.